Okay, thanks everyone. And I mean, that sort of brings us a bit full circle to, as I was trying to express the importance of understanding how these things can play out locally, but also recognising the bigger picture, because otherwise we all end up feeling a bit powerless when someone suddenly imposes something from outside which we hadn't expected. But we can plan for that. So I think we've still got 5 or 10 minutes time if people have got questions they'd like to raise. So if the people have got them, otherwise we can go and have a cup of tea or something. But no, you'll have to shout, I think, or you can come up and use the microphone here.
What ideas have you got to control buffel grass?
Buffel grass. I'll hand that one to one of you guys.
Can you just repeat the question?
Sorry, yes. So what ideas are there for controlling buffel grass? Let's get straight into it.
Buffel grass, I think, is a really big problem, and I would prefer to see an approach which is a bit like disease epidemiology, and so perhaps for us to think about how to stop its further spread rather than necessarily to control where it is. That's a really big social question because it really requires people to engage in minimising its spread. How? I think ultimately it's going to be a matter of a combination of a quarantine system. So, in the same way that people worry about whether there's mud on their boots when they're going in and out of, say, diseased orchards, that business with bananas up in the top end recently. And perhaps, spraying type approaches when there's a small outbreak in a place that previously has not already had buffel grass.
Shall I just summarise that? So, if people couldn't hear, so is buffel actually naturally constrained to some parts of the environment? And is that one pathway to recognising that there'll be some limitations? Are there options for more biological control? But also, in fact, behind that all, are there some more general things where we could just be able to socially get a better handle on it, really, and allow natural events to take their course?
Just briefly in response to that. I used to think that buffel was constrained to certain parts of the landscape, but when I came back after 16 years away from Alice Springs, that was knocked out of me because there were upland, range, infertile sites which have gone from spinifex to buffel grass, and not just unusual patches, but whole sections of the heavy tree range have done that. So I think there's probably some sort of genetic diversification going on where actually buffel may be expanding its options in the landscape. So that's the negative side. On the positive side, I wouldn't want to leap into faith-based landscape management and hope that there's a miracle solution. But one thing. One thing I can tell you is that there's a certain percentage of nationally declared weeds of significance which are showing signs of decline, at least in some parts of Australia. And so you might hope that one day buffel might cross the peak of its distribution and something out there, some disease, some response from the native biota or whatever might take over. And there's evidence for other problem species in Australia for that already having happened, but I don't see anything on the horizon yet, so it would still be faith-based to take that pathway.
But buffel, of course, isn't declared as a weed of national significance. It's got quite contested values because it's valued for pasture grass. We can take some hope that gamba grass in the top end, which was in the same situation, has recently been declared a weed of national significance. That means that landholders can't plant it, you can't sell it, and landholders are obliged to control it. The question about does it only affect fertile areas, what my thinking is about that is there are an awful lot of fertile areas in Central Australia which are not yet infested by buffel. Particularly if you go south of the Northern Territory, particularly if you go into the stony deserts and the creek lines there. Fertile areas, of course, are important for all kinds of things, and part of the priority strategy for keeping buffel out, stopping it spreading further, really should be concentrating on those fertile areas because they're important landscape patches and refugia for all kinds of species.
Yeah, and just on that idea of a contested space, remember that, up in the top end with small mammal decline, cats would be equivalent. Cats are both evil and a domestic pet that people love. And so there's an equivalent problem where some of the drivers of a chronic change in the landscape are contested.
Okay, so Buffalo is a fantastic microcosm of all of these complex issues, and we could easily talk more. But let's see if there's other questions. Yeah.
I'd be very interested. My name's Meredith, and I'm a visitor here. It's my first visit to
I say, so a question about water management in both the sort of urban side here in Alice and the more general, and in relation to tourism and the more general aspects out on the landscape.
And I think given his broad worldview, Mark is the best place to answer that question.
All right, well, I'll talk about the urban one just for a moment first, because I think there was a really interesting process that was gone through, and I actually don't know where it's got to now because I've been away for a few years, but of a real community process looking at water planning for Alice Springs, and I think it's a really interesting example of where engaging the community can actually get an outcome which is quite unexpected. So the water authorities here, I've forgotten what it's called now, but anyway, it wasn't Power and Water, it was the government part of it, but anyway, had gone into this process with the expectation that we should be doing planning which involved not letting the amount of water that was being taken out of the Marini aquifer here, which is very, very slow to be recharged, not letting it exceed much more than the amount that we were currently doing. I can't remember the numbers anymore. But the interesting thing was we went through a community process which included horticultural people here who wanted to use more water for irrigation. It included Power and Water, who are the actual authority delivering the water. But it included a whole lot of other community interests, including tourism. And the conclusion of the whole process was actually to try and set targets which were something like a tenth of that. So, I mean, there was no expectation in government that it was going to be possible to set something which was actually lower than the current level, including people who are wanting to actually develop new water uses for irrigation. Now, I don't know where that ended up, and in fact, the only player in that who was challenging it was Power and Water Authority, who was expecting to actually deliver more water into the future because you get more profits like that, which is being a bit unfair to them because they did come on board once they realised that the community was willing to actually see a reduction in it. So I just give that anecdote. It doesn't solve the issues that you're saying, but it does say that if you have the right social processes that Jocelyn was talking about, you can sometimes get quite surprising outcomes when people come to understand the strategic significance of what they're doing. The water issues here in town, I think, are somewhat different to the ones out bush, where it's. I mean, there are places which are using aquifers, of course, but I think you were referring more to the management of water holes and the issues around that. And there's a great deal of work going on in the Aboriginal area, thinking about the damage that animals like camels cause to those sorts of resources, and indeed the whole sort of issues of conservation around those, and gradually trying to zone those areas, which are often also the rich pockets in the landscape, which are also invaded by buffalo and everything else, but zone them so that we do have some which are genuinely protected in the long run. I don't know, Jocelyn, if you want to say any more from that point of view of cultural management of those sorts of things.
No, my thoughts are really about the town water. I remember coming up here in the 80s, and I've lived here about 8 years now, but I've worked into this area for longer, and I was up here in the 80s scoping out a university student excursion, and I talked to a number of people about water use in the town, and there were ideas from a number of people who've gone on to be behind and the founders of what we're seeing here today about shifting the culture of water use. And that was in the 1980s. Early 1990s, 1990. Now, it's taken 20 years. It's taken more than 20 years for that to bite. And the drought, I think, in the rest of Australia had a pretty big impact. The first 5 years when I was here were drought years. I was paying about half what what I paid for water in Adelaide when I lived there. tourists and visitors were coming here and being shocked that back home they were on water restrictions,
right.
and yet in Alice Springs there were sprinklers running, no one was caring about water. So I think in that case the actual consciousness of the tourism industry helped to bring about some traction locally for things like the Water Smart project, to really start to bite amongst local people to say, well, we actually have to change what we're doing here. Now the price of water has gone up. The government incentives that have got behind the Cool Mob and all the whole Desert Smart approach is starting to change the way we use water. But one invisible thing that is connected to the way we use water, our carbon emissions here are intimately connected to how much water we use, because so much diesel is used to pump the water up. So there's some quite big consequences and issues around water use.
So it's a really challenging area. There's plenty of, and it takes a long time to get those changes. But getting people like Costa here and getting him to stick some arid zone gardens on the next few garden shows or something like that is a good sort of step. We're coming close to the end of our time, I think. But let's just one more question here.
Well, it's not a question. Can I just
Oh,
say
yeah.
thank you very much to the three of you?
Okay, this sounds like a good wrap-up question.
Well, it is. I'm running a little thing called the Asia Pacific Environment Network, and I've just come back from Phuket. We had 400 students dealing with exactly the same issue in a mangrove area in Phuket. And the modelling that you've put up, I think, is fantastic. And I guess that what I'd like to be able to feel that I can access that
Sure.
somehow or other. We can use this modelling in other communities across Asia. As an educator, having been here at Ecology for a long time, the sad thing about it for me is you're saying you cannot see enough sort of work being done in terms of the long-term change. And I'm saying, is that a challenge for us in education in schools? Because when I go around to schools, the students are fantastic. They really want something to happen. We did energy audits to about 70 schools, Don't worry about the teachers, they're busy doing their NAT plan results. Don't worry about the principals. The students are the ones who are driving it. And I guess for things like this and so on, we've really got to work harder at negotiating the young people, because they're the ones who are going to drive it. So I guess that's say well done, a plug for education. And I'm sad that you don't think that there is enough people doing something about long-term strategic change.
Okay, I think that is a really nice wrap-up point, and I do think I think we'd all agree that education is incredibly important, and actually getting into the classroom the way of thinking that sees the whole system, can see those longer-term things, which isn't for everyone, but some people's brains like to sort of rave widely more than others. Mine certainly does. But anyway, the getting nonetheless the appreciation of the connectedness of different bits of our environment and our communities and different scales, just getting that understanding into people's heads suddenly means that, as in fact Dr. Carr was saying yesterday, when you get obvious porkies being told as part of a campaign or something, people can actually spot them, and that's the biggest defence we can have against them. So education is definitely really important. But let me, on behalf of you all, thank our colleagues here, who are in fact local, and you can come and talk to them anytime you like.